Hello, everyone. This is BL Confession Room, a channel dedicated to telling forbidden BL stories that will leave you speechless. Place for forbidden BL stories that you cannot pause once you start. This is the story of an Omega who agreed to be a surrogate for a wealthy, lonely alpha, thinking it would be a cold business deal for money, until the baby chose him as daddy, and the alpha realized that he had accidentally bought himself a whole family he didn't know he needed. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story that will steal hours of your sleep. And tell in the comments which city you're watching this from. Eli had learned to measure his days and invoices and overdue notices. His studio above a noisy laundromat smelled of detergent and damp plaster. At 24, he already felt older than most people his age, not because of years, but because of the weight of survival. He worked 2 part-time jobs, swallowed cheap hormone stabilizers that wrecked his sleep, and kept a folded sheet of paper under his mattress with 3 numbers that terrified him: rent, debt, and the cost of the next checkup for his unstable Omega physiology. The pregnancy test had changed everything and nothing at the same time. A thin plastic strip bought on discount in a corner pharmacy had turned a vague fear into a solid fact. There had been one night with a stranger who had liked the idea of a careless Omega and disappeared before morning. The result had left Eli alone, holding a future in his body and an almost empty wallet in his hands. For a short while he had pretended he still had options. He searched medical sites on his old phone until the screen burned his eyes, stared at forms that asked for insurance details he did not have, skimmed articles about what Omegas should or should not do. None of those words offered to pay his rent. When the landlord slipped another warning notice under his door and the pharmacy refused to extend his prescription on credit, the illusion of choice collapsed. The surrogacy agency felt like another world. The waiting room was gray and quiet, with soft music that sounded expensive and a poster promising life-changing compensation for surrogacy. For Eli, this place was the only door that looked even slightly open. When his name was called, he followed the consultant into a smaller room, softened with a pot plant and a bowl of wrapped sweets. The table between them was wide and glossy. There were folders in neat stacks, a cup of herbal tea at his elbow, a brochure explaining his journey as a surrogate. He registered the shapes of the words more than their meaning and focused on keeping his hands still on the armrests. The consultant slid a contract across the table. The numbers were dizzying next to the balance in Eli's bank account. Medical coverage throughout the pregnancy, regular stipends, a lump sum at the end big enough to clear most of his debts and pay for a small, safer apartment far from his current building. There were lines about counseling and postnatal support, as if whoever had designed the document understood that carrying a child and then letting it go did something to a person. In exchange, he would carry a child created from someone else's genetic material, give birth, and walk away with no legal rights or responsibilities. The clinic would manage everything. The intended parent wanted discretion and boundaries, no contact after, no shared holidays, no blurred lines. Eli had nodded quickly at that. Clean edges sounded merciful. The profile said the intended parent was a single alpha in his early 30s, successful, educated, high-income bracket. The file read like a resume rather than a person. Even the name, Adrian Shaw, felt smooth and polished. A small photograph showed a man in a dark suit, expression controlled, eyes steady on the camera, the kind of person whose life ran on schedules and forecasts. Eli let his gaze rest on that picture for a moment. Somewhere, in a high office or a silent house, this man had decided that he wanted a child without having to negotiate feelings with another adult. Must be nice, Eli thought, a bitter flicker in his chest, to choose fatherhood like a project instead of stumbling into it with no plan and no support. He stared at the page where he had to sign, knowing that this signature would turn his body into a temporary home for someone else's future. It would also buy his own future a little time. His mind flicked back to the folded paper under his mattress, to the 3 numbers that never stopped humming at the back of his thoughts. Rent, debt, medical bills. The contract in front of him was the first thing that had ever looked big enough to drown them out. Sign and survive, he told himself under his breath. The words sounded ugly in the quiet room and honest in a way nothing else had for weeks. When he finally pressed the pen to the paper, his hand shook, but not enough to blur his name. Each letter felt like a small surrender. In that moment, he convinced himself of one thing. He was selling a service, not his heart. The baby would not be his. The alpha would get an heir. Eli would get money and a chance to start over. It sounded transactional, clean, almost safe, the kind of safety that only existed on paper. When he left the agency clutching a folder of appointments and instructions, the city air felt colder than before. Eli walked back to his studio, counting the steps, promising without words that he would keep himself and the life inside him alive until it was time to let go. The first time Eli saw Adrian was through the glass wall of a consultation room that looked more like a designer showroom than a medical space. Frosted panels framed a wide window, and beyond it, the city dropped away in layers of steel and concrete. Inside, everything was controlled. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and citrus. Machines hummed quietly, their screens glowing with patient codes and graphs. Adrian stood near the monitor, a figure cut cleanly out of that controlled background. His suit was dark and perfectly fitted, no loose threads, no creases. His posture was straight, not in a showy, dominant way, but like someone who no longer remembered how to slouch. His eyes were fixed on the screen where hormone levels, implantation windows, and statistical curves were displayed in neat lines. The doctor spoke in practiced, measured phrases, outlining protocols and risks. Words like success rate, implantation window, multiple embryo strategy floated in the air. Adrian listened with the focus of someone used to high-stakes decisions, the kind where a misplaced comma could cost millions. He asked precise questions, always to the doctor. What happens if the first cycle fails? How soon can we adjust the medication? What is the safest window for transfer? His tone was calm, but there was a tension in it, like a wire pulled tight. Eli sat on the other side of the table, close enough to hear every word, far enough to feel invisible. The meeting, for him, was less an introduction and more an inspection. He had already been weighed and measured, scanned and labeled as medically suitable and psychologically stable enough. He had filled out forms about his family, previous illnesses, mental health. The words single and no involved partner appeared again and again in his file. They made the agency's job easier. No one else would complicate the contract or claim attachments later. From the corner of his eye, Eli studied Adrian the way you look at a painting you are not supposed to touch. The alpha's jaw was clean-shaven, his hair neat and deliberately unremarkable. He did not wear flashy jewelry or anything that screamed power. The only clue to his status was the discreet watch on his wrist and the way staff stepped a little faster around him without seeming to rush. Adrian's profile folder lay open on the table. Eli had seen parts of it already. A tech company built from a small startup into a mid-sized conglomerate, articles quoting him about innovation and efficiency. Photographs from conferences where he stood in front of large screens pointing at graphs. Online, people called him ambitious, efficient, sometimes ruthless. In person, he seemed contained, not hostile, not warm. Just someone who had taken all his emotions and locked them behind the same kind of glass that separated him now from the noise of the city. Eli noticed small things the doctor did not pause on. The way Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the tablet when miscarriage was mentioned. The way his eyes softened for a brief second when the doctor talked about the heartbeat they expected to see if the transfer took. That fleeting softness did not look like the hunger Eli was used to seeing in alphas staring at an omega body. It was something else, quieter and more dangerous. The hunger of someone who wanted just once to design a part of his life that would not leave him. The doctor turned, finally, towards Eli, explaining the injection schedule and dietary recommendations. Eli nodded when he was supposed to nod, answered when he was asked about allergies and previous reactions to medication. Once, he risked a glance at Adrian. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. "Thank you," Adrian said quietly, like he was talking to a colleague closing a crucial deal. Eli did not trust his own voice enough to answer. He just dipped his head and looked back at his hands. The embryo transfer itself was clinical and quick. The room was different, colder, the light more intense. Eli lay on the narrow bed, paper gown rustling when he shifted. Above him, a bright circle of light turned his skin pale. Nurses moved around him with brisk, practiced efficiency, checking monitors, confirming his identity, reading out numbers that the doctor acknowledged with short replies. Adrian was there too, on the other side of a thin curtain and a glass panel, separated by a few steps and an invisible wall of rolls. He stood close enough that Eli could sense his presence, hear the quiet shift of his shoes on the floor, but not close enough to make the moment intimate. It was as if he had found the exact distance where he could witness without being seen as vulnerable. On the monitor, Eli saw a magnified image of the inside of his own body, gray and white textures, the pointer moving with the doctor's hand. A tiny, bright speck appeared, almost nothing, just a possibility given shape by medical equipment and money. That speck was guided into place, into tissue that had signed away ownership of it before it existed. There, the doctor said softly, more to the screen than to either of them. It looked unimpressive, like a glitch. And yet the room held its breath for a second. Afterwards, Eli lay in recovery, under softer lights, with a warm blanket over his legs. His body felt emptier and heavier at the same time, full of someone else's future. Through a half-open door, he could hear the doctor talking to Adrian in the corridor. Implantation is never guaranteed. Nature still has the final say. We will know more in about 2 weeks. There was a pause, then Adrian's voice. If it fails, we adjust and try again. Eli stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. He did his own calculation, nothing to do with hormone levels. How many months he could afford emotionally to feel anything for a child that would never call him anything. How long he could keep pretending this was just work before his body betrayed him. Bye. He left the clinic that day with a list of medications, a schedule of visits, and a mantra he repeated silently on the bus ride home. The alpha on the other side of the glass was a client. The embryo was a project. His body was a rented space, client, project, space. Repeating those words under his breath, Eli watched the city slide past the window, aware that somewhere above all this, in an office wrapped in glass, the man in the tailored suit was already fitting him into a timeline on a digital calendar. It was easier to think of it that way, easier than admitting that something had shifted, small and irreversible, in both of their lives the moment that bright speck appeared on the screen. The pregnancy took. The first ultrasound showed a heartbeat, a flicker on the screen that made the nurse smile automatically, and the doctor's voice softened for a moment. Eli watched the tiny pulsing shape and tried to feel nothing, tried to see it as proof that the contract was working, nothing more. The doctor congratulated them both. Adrian shook Eli's hand, firm and professional, as if they had just closed a deal rather than set a life in motion between them. As the weeks turned into months, Eli's world split cleanly in two. There was his cramped studio above the laundromat where the air was always heavy with steam, detergent, and fried food from the shop next door. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarettes. Buses to work arrived late or not at all. Cheap groceries filled the small fridge, plastic bags of rice, bruised vegetables, instant soup packets. His clothes stretched tighter around his steadily growing belly, the seams complaining before he did. Then there were the visits to the clinic where everything smelled of antiseptic and money. There, floors shone, walls were quiet, and staff called him Mr. Hart with careful respect because of whose contract was attached to his file. They offered water in glass instead of plastic and draped warm blankets over him during scans. In those rooms, his pregnancy was a project with tracked milestones and graphs. Back in his building, it was just another weight to carry up too many stairs. Adrian appeared at the key appointments always on time, always composed. He stood or sat with the same contained posture, listening to updates, approving additional tests, signing payment authorizations without flinching at the amounts. He asked Eli if he had everything he needed in a neutral tone, the way someone might check whether a supplier had received raw materials. "If you need anything, tell the agency," he said once, almost as an afterthought. Eli nodded, knowing that what he needed most could not be requested on any form. He needed his back not to ache constantly, his lungs not to burn when he climbed stairs, his mind not to spin at night between fear and a strange, growing tenderness, whenever the baby shifted under his skin. During one routine check, the doctor frowned at the blood pressure readings and the notes about Eli's living conditions: long commutes, physical strain, lack of proper rest. The recommendation came quietly but firmly. "In the last trimester, we would prefer you closer to the clinic," the doctor said. "Less travel, less stress. It reduces risk for both surrogate and child." Adrian took that suggestion the way he took all problems, as something to be solved. Eli saw his gaze sharpen, not with anger, but with calculation. By the time Eli was home that evening, the agency had already called. They offered him an option that sounded unreal when spoken into his cheap phone: temporary relocation to a guest suite on Adrian's property, a private nurse on call, transport arranged, expenses covered, boundaries and privacy guaranteed. It was framed as a standard package for high-profile clients, nothing personal, just best practice. Eli hesitated. Eli. The idea of moving into the alpha's space pressed against every instinct to stay small and unseen. Yet his own body betrayed him. He woke at night with his back on fire from the sagging mattress. He had to stop halfway up the stairs to catch his breath, heart pounding too fast. His ankles swelled after long shifts. When he imagined collapsing in that hallway alone, with no one to call except an overworked emergency operator, fear pushed harder than pride. The contract was adjusted. New clauses about boundaries, about the fact that he was there as a surrogate and not a member of the household. No shared meals required, no social obligations. Access to the garden at certain hours, nurse visits scheduled, doors that would remain locked and others he was welcome to use. Papers were signed again, and his life shifted location with a single signature. The house on the hill was cleaner and quieter than anywhere Eli had ever lived. The driveway curved through manicured trees, leading to a building of glass and stone that reflected the sky more than it revealed. Inside, large windows let in pale light. Walls held subtle art that looked expensive and distant. The air was adjusted to a perfect temperature, neither too warm nor too cold. The guest suite was at the far end of a hallway. It had its own small living room with a narrow sofa, a bedroom with a wide bed dressed in crisp sheets, and a bathroom where the water pressure never faltered. A nurse visited every day, checking his vitals, adjusting medications, asking about dizziness and swelling, reminding him to eat more protein and drink more water. She wrote notes into a tablet that synced somewhere Eli would never see. In the main part of the house, the rhythm of Adrian's life continued mostly out of sight. Conference calls drifted down the hall as muffled voices behind closed doors. Car engines started and stopped in the driveway. Staff moved with the hushed efficiency of people trained to be present without being obvious. Sometimes Eli saw Adrian in passing. Early in the morning in the kitchen, the alpha would stand alone, hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for answers there. In the hallway, he sometimes paused outside the room being prepared as a nursery, fingers brushing briefly against the doorframe before he walked on without going in. There was a distance in him that matched the square meters of his home, a kind of loneliness that no number of employees or screens could fill. Eli kept to his side of the house. He ate meals delivered on trays, took slow walks in the small garden behind the guest suite, practiced the breathing exercises the nurse had taught him. The silence was heavier than the noise of the laundromat, but kinder to his body. He could sleep without hearing arguments through thin walls, wake without a neighbor's music pounding against his skull. At night, he lay on those unfamiliar crisp sheets, one hand on his stomach, feeling the kicks that were growing stronger. The baby responded to his voice when he hummed under his breath, settled when he slowed his breathing, rolled restlessly when he was anxious. In those quiet hours, with only the soft hum of the house for company, the bond grew in ways no contract could prevent. "This is temporary," he told himself often, sometimes out loud in a whisper. "You are a guest. You are a surrogate. You leave when this is over." He imagined the room after he was gone. The bed made up for some visiting relative, or a live-in nanny hired to take his place, or left empty most of the year. He pictured the nursery completed, full of carefully chosen furniture and toys, waiting for a child who would grow up calling someone else Daddy. Yet even as he insisted on that vision, he could feel the house rearranging itself around the invisible presence it now held. Extra deliveries arrived, baby items in plain cardboard boxes. A painter came and went, leaving the faint smell of fresh paint near the nursery door. Conversations on the phone in Adrian's office sometimes included words like leave, paternity, school districts. The future was being built in parallel layers, one in emails and plans, one in heartbeats under Eli's palm. He was living in a guest room at the edge of another man's carefully organized life, close enough to feel the pull of its center, far enough to pretend he was not already part of its orbit. The birth did not follow the neat timeline printed in the doctor's folder. It came earlier than expected, in the middle of a heavy storm that wrapped the house on the hill in wind and rain. The windows shook softly in their frames, and distant thunder rolled over the city like something alive. Eli woke to a tightness in his abdomen that did not feel like the usual slow ache. It was sharp, deliberate, a grip from the inside. The next wave made him gasp and curl forward, one hand clutching at the sheets. The monitor by his bed registered the change before his mind caught up. Sensors lit up, numbers shifting, an alarm flickering silently in the corner. A soft chime in the hallway summoned the nurse faster than a shouted word. She appeared at his side, hair pulled back, face alert in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with training. Her hands were cool and steady on his wrist, her voice low as she counted his breathing and the intervals between contractions. It escalated quickly. Another contraction hit and tore a sound out of him that he had not planned to let anyone hear. The nurse reached for the phone, calling the clinic, calling the driver, turning the quiet guest suite into the center of a small, efficient storm. Somewhere down the hall, doors opened, footsteps moved with purpose. An ambulance pulled into the private driveway, red and blue lights bouncing off wet stone and glass. Adrian appeared in the doorway, caught between sleep and crisis. His hair was mussed, shirt only half buttoned, bare feet on the polished floor. For the first time, Eli saw him without the armor of a suit, stripped down to a man jerked out of his ordered life by the sound of pain in his own house. His eyes were sharp, fully awake in an instant, scanning the scene, landing on Eli with a flash of something that looked like fear. Eli registered him at the edge of his vision. Then another contraction crashed over him and narrowed the world to breath counts and white pain. The nurse and paramedics moved him onto a stretcher, secured lines, covered him with blankets. Rain hit his face in brief, cold needles as they wheeled him through the covered entrance. Inside the ambulance, the siren stayed low, out of respect for the hour in the neighborhood. But the speed said enough. Eli clenched his jaw, knuckles white around the metal rail. The delivery room at the clinic had been designed to look less clinical than it was. Softened lighting, walls painted in calming tones, monitors arranged discreetly behind panels. For Eli, it was still bright, cold, and overwhelming. His body trembled on the bed, not only from the physical intensity, but from the awareness that this was the moment when the child would become a separate being and legally no longer his. Time blurred and stretched. Nurses spoke in short sentences to one another, reading out numbers, tracking dilation, checking heart rates. The doctor's voice cut through the haze at intervals, giving instructions, adjusting the plan as the labor progressed faster than expected. Eli clung to small anchors, the pressure of a hand on his shoulder, the rhythm of oxygen flowing. His own breath as he counted slowly, trying not to lose himself when each contraction rose like a wave and broke over him. At some point he realized Adrian was there, not at the foot of the bed where the team worked, but off to the side, near the wall. He stood with his hands at his sides, fingers flexing once in a while as if restraining the instinct to reach out. He wore a disposable gown over his half-buttoned shirt, a thin barrier that did nothing to hide the raw tension in his posture. In any other room, Adrian Shaw would have been the one giving orders. Here, surrounded by medical equipment and urgency, he was just another witness. The peak came suddenly. The doctor's voice shifted, firmer now, telling him to push, telling him he was close. Eli bore down, muscles burning, a tearing sensation ripping through him that felt like it came from his chest as much as his body. For a suspended moment, everything in the room narrowed to that effort, to that crossing. Then it broke, and with it came a rush of relief so intense it almost knocked him out, followed by a tiny, outraged cry that sliced through the layered sounds of machines and instructions. They placed the newborn on his chest while the team continued to work, hands moving with practiced speed around them. Warm, slippery weight, lighter than Eli had imagined and heavier than anything he had ever held. The baby's heartbeat thudded against his skin, fast and frantic. Tiny fingers curled instinctively, clutching at the thin fabric of the hospital gown. Eli's hand rose without thought to cradle the small, damp head, thumb brushing the soft, unfamiliar texture of brand-new hair. Something ancient and wordless passed between them in that touch. It was the same sense of recognition he had felt in the quiet nights when the baby had rolled under his ribs, magnified now into something that hurt to contain. For the first time, the presence inside him had a face, a sound, a weight. His chest ached with it. According to the script, this contact was meant to be short, skin to skin for a minute to stabilize breathing and temperature, then separation. The baby would be measured, cleaned, wrapped, and presented to Adrian, the legal father, for his first proper hold. The contract made no provision for lingering. They tried to follow it. A nurse lifted the baby gently, voice soothing, and moved towards the weighing scale. The moment the warmth left his chest, the infant's cry sharpened. At first, it was just louder. Then the sound pitched higher, from protest to panic. Monitors reacted in real time, heart rate spiking, tiny chest working too fast. The nurse glanced at the doctor. "Bring him back," was the silent instruction that passed between them. The baby was placed again on Eli's chest. Almost at once, the crying hiccuped, faltered, and then dropped into uneven, softer sounds. The heartbeat slowed into a more stable rhythm. His small body relaxed, molding itself into the curve of Eli's. They tested it again, because protocol demanded measurements and checks. Lifted away, the baby's distress surged. Restored to the familiar scent and rhythm, he calmed. Once, twice, a third time. By then, even the doctor, who believed in data and standard procedures, lifted a hand and let it fall in a small gesture of surrender. "Let him stay a while," he said quietly. "He has chosen where he wants to be." From his place at the side of the room, Adrian watched, face carefully unreadable. He saw his child, the heir he had planned for, rejecting the neutral arms of trained staff and settling only in the embrace of the Omega he had paid to carry him. The logic of contracts, genetic tests, and surnames ran up against the irrational reality of early attachment. A fine crack appeared in the script he had built in his head. Single alpha father, controlled environment, clean handover. It was not jealousy that cut into him then, not exactly. It was something closer to shock at being displaced in a moment he had believed would center him. He had imagined cradling his son in a calm, orderly room, feeling gratitude towards the surrogate and then guiding their lives onto separate tracks. Instead, he stood by while a tiny new life clung to someone else, as if the world would end if that connection broke. Eli, exhausted and half-drifting, did not yet realize how permanent that crack would become. He only knew that the weight on his chest felt right in a way no document could touch. When, later, they finally took the baby for checks and stitched what needed to be repaired, the sudden absence of warmth made the hospital bed feel violently empty. His hands ached with the memory of holding, his skin with the fading imprint of tiny fingers, and somewhere deep inside, the idea that he could still walk away clean after this began to crumble without a sound. The days after the birth blurred into a strange, suspended routine. Eli stayed in the clinic longer than the contract had ever planned for. On paper, the doctor wrote phrases like extended observation, postnatal stabilization, monitoring due to blood loss and blood pressure fluctuations. Those explanations satisfied the files and the insurance codes. Unofficially, everyone could see the simpler truth. The baby settled only when he was close to Eli. Nurses tried to follow policy at first. They wheeled the baby into the neonatal room, placed him in the clear plastic crib under soft lights, checked his temperature and breathing. Within minutes, the peaceful bundle became a red-faced knot of panic. The cries escalated, thin at first, then jagged, punching through the walls. Monitors reflected the spiral. Heart rate spiking, oxygen saturation dipping, small chest working too hard. "Bring him back," one of the nurses muttered, already reaching for the crib. "This is pointless." Laid against Eli's chest, the baby calmed with an almost violent speed. Tiny fists unclenched, breaths evened out, the frantic beats of his heart aligning with Eli's slower rhythm. It happened again and again, attempts to move directly to full-time care by Adrian, ended in hours of crying that left everyone, including the alpha, hollow-eyed and on edge. A compromise formed almost on its own, born less from theory and more from sheer exhaustion. Eli would stay nearby as a postnatal caregiver until the baby's nervous system stabilized and the attachment widened. The agency drafted an addendum, language carefully neutral. His presence was framed as a paid service separate from surrogacy, an extension of care. It sounded safer to call him a nanny than to admit the truth written in the baby's every reaction, that this child recognized his scent, his heartbeat, his rhythm as home. Back in the house on the hill, spaces began to rearrange themselves. The nursery, with its pale walls and carefully chosen furniture, became the new center of gravity. Eli's guest room, once meant to be a temporary convenience, now sat between the nursery and the rest of the house like a buffer zone. Doors were left ajar at night, monitors hummed softly, a thin river of light ran along the corridor. Nights turned into cycles of waking, feeding, rocking. Eli's body reacted before his mind did. A whimper over the monitor, a shift in the air, and he was already halfway out of bed by the time he fully woke, feet finding the path to the crib in the dark. He moved with the automatic grace of someone whose nervous system had been wired to this particular infant for months. He knew which cries meant hunger, which meant discomfort, which were just the baby fighting sleep. Adrian tried. He was not absent, not cruel, not indifferent. He took turns holding the baby as instructed, supporting the tiny head with careful hands. He stayed up late, pacing the floor, bouncing gently, humming under his breath in a voice unused to lullabies. He read articles on his tablet about infant soothing techniques and tried them one by one. He listened when nurses suggested skin-to-skin contact, adjusted his schedule to be home more often. Sometimes it worked for a while. In Adrian's arms, the baby might drift, eyelids heavy, gaze unfocused. But the calm was fragile. A squeak from the floorboard, a shadow moving in the doorway, the faintest shift of scent when Eli left the room, and the tension returned. The baby's body stiffened, his face crumpled, and the cries rose again, as if he'd been left alone in some huge, cold space. The pattern became brutally clear. Full relaxation on Eli's chest. Partial calm in Adrian's arms, so long as Eli was somewhere nearby, within reach if things became too much. Escalating distress when Eli was entirely absent. For Eli, this created an emotional landscape that felt impossible to navigate. He was being paid to care, and yet quietly instructed not to attach. He was essential to the child's sense of safety, and yet reminded in every formal conversation that the child was not his. He spent hours with warm, breathing weight resting against his heart, absorbing the baby's smell into his clothes, learning the pattern of tiny hands flexing in sleep. At the same time, he forced his thoughts to stop before words like first birthday, first word, school. You are staff, he told himself during long, rocking nights. You are staff, not family. The more he tried to stay in the role of a professional caregiver, the more his body betrayed him. A surge of fierce protectiveness rose in him whenever someone else handled the baby too briskly or spoke too loudly near the crib. On rare outings to the clinic or the garden, he found himself automatically stepping between the stroller and strangers who drifted too close, his hand tightening on the handle. At night, even when the monitors were quiet, he lay awake counting the baby's breaths, listening for any change in the rhythm. The house staff adjusted to this new order of things quicker than the contracts did. For them, Eli was simply there whenever the baby was. They stopped knocking on Adrian's office door with questions about feeding schedules and came to Eli instead. They brought him tea and extra snacks when they noticed him skipping meals, knocked on his door if the baby monitor glitched, adjusted cleaning routines so as not to disturb daytime naps. Without anyone formally assigning the role, Eli became the central presence in the small ecosystem that had grown around one very small person. The cook set aside soft foods for him when his appetite dipped. The driver learned the routes to the pediatrician's office by heart. The housekeeper started leaving folded muslin cloths on a specific shelf in his room, because that was where he always reached for them. Adrian watched this from a shifting distance. He was present, but not always at the center of the scene. Sometimes he stood in the doorway of the nursery and saw a picture that did not match the one he had paid for. An omega in soft clothes, hair pulled back hastily, a baby sprawled across his chest, both of them asleep in a stolen hour of afternoon quiet. Sometimes he came home late and found the two of them on the living room sofa, the television turned down low, the baby's small hand fisted in the fabric of Eli's shirt as if to anchor himself. The image looked suspiciously like family, something he had never meant to build with anyone. The fact that it stirred something in him he could not immediately name made it harder, not easier, to accept. He had wanted an air and a clean arrangement. What he was getting instead was a life with edges he had not anticipated, and a man in his guest room who was, in everything but name, parenting his son. Adrian had always believed that control was a simple equation. Choose a goal, identify the variables, eliminate risk where possible, accept the remainder as the price of doing business. It had worked for boardrooms and negotiations, for acquisitions and exits. When he decided to become a father on his own, he approached it with the same method: a surrogate, a contract, a nursery, a carefully curated circle of caregivers, no messy entanglements, no unpredictable partners, no late-night arguments about parenting styles. One man, one child, one legacy. The reality in his house refused to fit into that frame. Every morning now, he woke up not to the quiet buzz of his phone, but to faint soft sounds in the hallway. The squeak of floorboards under light footsteps. A small, half-strangled baby noise, somewhere between a complaint and a sigh. By the time he reached the kitchen, Eli was usually already there, hair mussed, eyes still heavy with sleep, holding the baby against one shoulder while making coffee with the other hand. It looked too natural. Two bodies moving in sync around each other, Eli shifting his weight automatically when the baby squirmed, bumping a cabinet door closed with his hip so it would not slam. The baby's head rested under Eli's chin, mouth slack, hands relaxed. It did not look like a hired arrangement. It looked like a life that had been there for years and he had just walked into it. Adrian tried to increase his presence in practical ways. That was what he knew how to do. He asked his assistant to clear certain evenings. He canceled trips that could be handled over video calls. He set reminders on his phone for bath nights and vaccination appointments. Between meetings, he scrolled through parenting guides instead of market reports, absorbing lists of milestones and symptoms and best practices. He took over bath time twice a week. The first few times, his movements were stiff, terrified of letting the slippery, fragile body sink too low in the water. Eli knelt nearby on the bathroom floor, ready to intervene, but mostly just watched, giving small pointers when necessary. Slowly, Adrian learned how to support the tiny head without clutching, how to read the twitch that meant overstimulation, the yawn that meant they had a few minutes before a meltdown. He insisted on at least one, feeding a day being his responsibility. Holding the bottle, watching the baby's throat move as he swallowed, feeling the surprising weight of such a small person in the crook of his arm. At first, Eli had to guide his hands into the right angle, adjust the pillow, correct the way he held the bottle so that air would not be swallowed with the milk. Adrian accepted the guidance with more humility than he showed in any other context, yet every attempt revealed a new layer of his own insecurity. When the baby fussed in his arms, back arching, face turning mottled red, Adrian felt something cold wrap around his ribs. He did everything the book suggested. He shifted positions, walked, hummed, patted small circles on the tiny back. Sometimes it worked for a few minutes. Then the baby's mouth would open wider, the cry tipping into a raw, panicked edge. Then Eli would step closer, stretching out his arms almost apologetically. The transfer was always the same. The baby's body, tense as wire in Adrian's hold, melted almost immediately against Eli's chest. The noise dropped from a wail to a whimper, then to silence broken only by little gasps. The contrast was brutal. It felt like a personal failure, even when he knew, rationally, that it was not. The therapist they would later meet would call it primary attachment, predictable and normal. In the moment, it felt like being pushed to the edge of his own story. In the nursery, Eli moved with an ease that made Adrian's chest tighten. He anticipated needs before they were expressed. A fresh diaper in his hand before the old one hit the bin, a muslin cloth draped over his shoulder before a burp, a soft toy offered just as tiny hands began to search blindly. He remembered the last feeding time without checking logs, felt the change in the baby's breathing without looking at the monitor. Adrian, who could hold entire quarterly forecasts in his head, found himself standing in doorways, feeling like a guest in the small, warm space that had become the center of his house. He told himself that this was temporary, that once the child grew past this stage, the attachment to Eli would naturally weaken. Children adapted. They widened their circles. The contract would eventually reach its endpoint. Eli would move out with a healthy sum, and the household would reset around a single alpha and his heir. It sounded reasonable in his head, close enough to his original plan that he could cling to it. At the same time, he caught himself doing things that did not align with that plan at all. He started asking about Eli's health outside of pregnancy-related metrics. Did you sleep at all last night? Are the headaches getting better? Do you need a day off? He noticed when Eli ate too little because he was too busy bouncing the baby on one hip. Without making a point of it, Adrian began to bring plates to the nursery, setting them on the low dresser with a quiet, "This is for you, not just for him." When he saw Eli shiver during early mornings, bare feet on cold tile, he adjusted the thermostat, added an extra blanket to the back of the couch without comment. He found himself looking forward to moments that were not in any schedule. Evenings when the three of them ended up in the same room by accident, the television murmuring in the background, Eli half dozing while the baby kicked on his chest. Late afternoons when he came back from a meeting to find the house humming softly instead of echoing. The sight of tiny clothes drying on a rack in the guest bathroom made something unclench in him that he did not have language for. It unnerved him. This was not what he had set out to buy. He had built his one-man fantasy carefully, pruning away anything that looked like dependency. Now, somewhere between the nursery and the home office, that fantasy was cracking. The lines were fine at first, barely visible. A second mug on the kitchen counter. A laugh from the guest room that pulled his attention away from the screen. The instinctive way he checked that both doors, not just his own, were locked at night. Adrian was the last one willing to admit it, but the structure of his life had already shifted. He no longer moved through a house designed for a single man and his heir. He moved through a space where a child reached for an omega first, and where, more and more often, his own steps curved towards them instead of away. Leo reached that wobbly, dangerous age between first steps and second words. His world no longer fit inside the rails of a crib or the safe circle of a playmat. He learned to pull himself up on furniture, palms slapping against wood as he grunted with effort. He toddled from one pair of open arms to another, legs stiff, knees unsure, trusting gravity only because the floor had caught him so many times before. The house became a map of small obsessions. The strip of sunlight that moved across the hardwood floor in the living room, the row of books on a low shelf that he loved to pull out one by one, the cool glass of the patio door where he pressed his hand and breathed fog onto the surface. Hallways, once just empty distance between rooms, were now racetracks for unsteady steps and soft, triumphant squeals. Language arrived slowly, in pieces. Babbling first, strings of sounds that meant everything and nothing, then repeated syllables, favorite noises he tried out at different volumes to see what happened. Eli spent hours narrating their days in a soft, steady voice, walking that careful line the rules had drawn for him. He did not say the forbidden words, the ones that would claim roles. He talked instead about toys and food and weather. This is your blue bear. These are your socks. Outside, it is raining. Leo answered with gurgles and the occasional sound that almost resembled a word he had heard from adults. Sometimes he pointed at something and produced a burst of noise that only made sense in context. Eli responded as if he had spoken clearly, reinforcing the connection. It was their private language, built from half words and full attention. Adrian watched the process with a different kind of awe. He had missed these small stages in other people's children, too busy or too distant to care. Here, he saw how understanding arrived long before clear pronunciation. Leo recognized his own name, turning his head towards either of them when they called. He understood no, even if he tested it often, looking back with a small mischievous spark before reaching again for whatever he had been warned away from. One afternoon, the three of them ended up in the living room by accident rather than design. Adrian had come home early, a rare gap in his calendar created by a canceled meeting. Eli had brought Leo out from the nursery because the child was restless and fascinated by the way light fell in bright rectangles on the floor. Toys lay scattered across the rug, a colorful debris field of blocks and stuffed animals. The television was off. The house was quiet in that particular way that feels like the moment just before someone takes a breath. Adrian sat on the couch, jacket abandoned somewhere else, sleeves rolled up. Eli knelt near the coffee table, close enough to catch Leo if he toppled, far enough to let him try. Leo stood between them, one small hand pressed flat on the table for balance, chubby toes curling against the wood. His face was lit with fierce concentration, mouth slightly open, brows drawn together as if he were trying to solve a complicated problem. He took one unsteady step toward Adrian, then shifted his weight and took another towards Eli, testing his own confidence in this new thing his body could do. His arms hovered out at his sides like wings. His mouth moved in a determined effort to form a sound he had been practicing silently for days. His eyes, dark and bright, flicked between the two adults who anchored his small universe. The word came out imperfectly, thick with toddler effort, but clear enough that both of them heard it at the same time. 2 syllables, slurred at the edges but unmistakable in shape, dropped into the space between them and pointed, without question, in Eli's direction. Daddy. It was not just a sound. It carried with it the weight of sleepless nights spent pressed against the same chest, the memory written into Leo's bones of hands that had picked him up before the first cry fully formed. A scent his nervous system had catalogued as absolute safety long before his brain knew any names. Adrian froze. He had known, in the abstract, that early attachments were strong. He had read about imprinting, about how babies associate comfort with the person who responds first and most consistently. On a screen, those words had been theory. In his living room, they became a blade. Hearing his child's first real relational word aimed at someone else split open the carefully maintained story in his head. He was supposed to be the central parent. Eli was supposed to be a helper, a phase, a professional presence who would exit when the contract said so. That story collapsed under the weight of one small voice and 2 imperfect syllables. Eli felt the impact too. The word hit him low in his chest, like a fist from the inside, breaking through every boundary he had so carefully built. He had promised himself never to be that person for this child, never to step into a role the contract denied him. He had repeated it in therapy forums and agency interviews and quiet nights when Leo slept on his chest. You are the surrogate, you are the caregiver, you are not daddy, yet there it was, offered freely by the only person whose opinion truly mattered in this context. Leo did not know about legal rights or genetic tests or planned narratives. He only knew who picked him up when everything felt too loud, who smelled right, whose heartbeat matched the rhythm that had wrapped him in the dark before he had a face. For a moment the room seemed to shrink. The walls drew closer, the ceiling dipped. The silence that followed was so complete that Leo's small breath and the faint humming of the refrigerator in the kitchen were suddenly huge. Eli wished, briefly and violently, that the floor would open under him just so he would not have to see the expression on Adrian's face. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something softer and more dangerous. Grief, for a fantasy that had just shattered. Surprise that he could feel this much over one small word, a hollow kind of breaking, as if a support beam had been quietly removed from the structure of his life. He had succeeded in buying an heir. He had not prepared for the possibility that the child would also choose someone else as a primary parent, and that his own heart would lean towards that same person in ways he still refused to name. Leo, oblivious to the earthquake he had triggered, wobbled again and dropped down on his bottom with a soft thud, distracted by a nearby block. He reached for it with a pleased little hum, already moving on to the next tiny adventure, but the word he had spoken did not move on. It hung in the air, awkward and beautiful and devastating all at once, long after his attention had shifted. It settled into the house, into the way they looked at each other, into the spaces between contracts and routines. From that moment on, none of them could convincingly pretend that what they shared was temporary, or that roles were as simple as the forms they had signed. The days after Leo's first attempt at naming Eli were thick with silence where conversations should have been. Practical tasks continued because they had to. Nappies were changed, tiny shirts were wrestled over a stubborn head, dishes were washed, meetings were attended. From the outside, nothing looked different. The same cars came and went from the driveway, the same lights burned late in Adrian's office. Inwardly, nothing was the same. Adrian began to time his movements through the house without admitting it to himself. He knew roughly when Eli took Leo to the living room to play in the late morning light and chose that hour to lock himself in the office. He avoided walking past the nursery at bedtime because that was when he would hear Eli singing under his breath, a low, tuneless murmur that somehow always worked. It was easier to pretend he was needed elsewhere than to stand in doorways watching bonds he had not planned forming in front of him. Eli, for his part, started second-guessing every affectionate gesture. His hands, which had once moved without thinking, now hesitated. Should he scoop Leo up the moment he lifted his arms, or wait a beat, give Adrian a chance to respond first? Should he kiss the soft curls when Leo collapsed against his shoulder, or hold himself still, as if distance could protect them both? Each time he tried to hold back, guilt burned through him. He is a child, he thought. Over and over, he reached for you. You do not pull away from that. Reality eventually forced words into the open. Leo's attachment patterns were not a secret, not to anyone who had been paying attention. The pediatrician had commented on them before, noting the strength of the bond and warning, gently but clearly, against sudden removal of Eli from the child's daily life. Those notes, once just another line in a medical file, now felt heavier. The agency noticed the extended postnatal arrangements stretching far beyond their usual timelines. A polite email arrived first, asking for clarification on the duration of Eli's live enroll. A call followed, more direct, checking whether boundaries were being respected, whether the original contract still reflected everyone's intentions. Nursery brochures began to arrive, thick paper and bright photos. Each had lines on the back for contact details, name of parent or guardian 1, name of parent or guardian 2. There was no box for anything in between. Insurance forms landed on Adrian's desk, phrases like legal guardian and next of kin printed in calm black letters. The system wanted clear answers. Who is responsible? Who can consent? Who can pick up this child if something happens to you? Adrian did what he always did when confronted with complexity that would not flatten itself on its own. He sought expert advice. Lawyers spread the original surrogacy contract and its addenda out on a polished table. They traced clauses with fingers, speaking in measured tones about what could and could not be changed. Some sections were set in stone, others had room for interpretation. Retroactive parentage rights were complicated, they said. But acknowledging a long-term caregiver, granting specific powers of decision, that was possible. Family therapists examined the dynamic from another angle. They asked about daily routines, who responded first at night, who Leo ran to when he fell. They highlighted the risks of pretending Eli was just an employee when both he and the child clearly experienced something else. Language mattered, they said, but behavior mattered more. A child learned from what was lived, not from what was written. A social worker, quietly looped in to ensure the child's welfare, sat with them once at the long dining table and asked the simplest, most dangerous question. If he woke up tomorrow and Eli was gone, what would that do to him? No one answered quickly. The conclusion, repeated in different vocabularies, came down to one uncomfortable truth. The situation did not fit into existing boxes. Eli was not a traditional co-parent. He had no genetic link, no initial intention to be anything beyond a surrogate. Adrian was not an absent father. He was present, emotionally involved, making decisions and sacrifices. Leo, however, had cut through all these categories by simply attaching to the people who had been there when he cried. Therapy sessions became part of the new routine, slotted between business calls and nap schedules. The office in the city gave way to a neutral room with neutral furniture, chairs placed at equal distances, a box of tissues on a low table. There, without the insulation of status or roles, truths began to slip out. Adrian spoke, slowly at first, about his childhood in a house where emotions were treated like leaks to be sealed, feelings were messes, contracts were safety. He admitted, staring at some vague point on the wall, that he had chosen single fatherhood because it let him control the story. No partner to disappoint, no relationship to watch rot from the inside. Just him and a child, on paper at least. Eli, usually quiet in any group, found himself speaking about different ghosts, about growing up being told that Omegas were replaceable, valuable only if they were useful and quiet, about his fear of being thanked and then discarded once he had done his job, about the way his whole body locked up when anyone used the word attachment in the same sentence as his name, because he knew how easily attachments could be punished. Sometimes the therapist said very little, letting their words fill the space and bounce back to them with altered weight. Sometimes she cut gently through their defenses. "You both keep talking about what was planned," she said once. "I am more interested in what is true now." What was true now was simple and terrifying. Leo saw Eli as a father figure. Adrian felt something deeper than gratitude towards Eli, a blend of trust, reliance, and a slowly dawning affection he did not have a clean label for yet. Eli was already living as a parent in every way except official recognition. There was no single form they could sign to fix this, no standard template for a single alpha who hired a surrogate and ended up emotionally attached to both child and surrogate. But there were steps they could take. A new legal agreement acknowledging Eli as a long-term caregiver with specific rights, authority to make medical decisions in emergencies, the right to be informed, to be present, a will rewritten to protect Leo in case something happened to Adrian, ensuring that custody would not default automatically to distant relatives who had never heard the child's laugh. A gradual reframing, too, in the language they used. Staff were encouraged to refer to Eli not as the nanny, but as one of Leo's parents in front of the child. Forms, where possible, listed him as an emergency contact alongside Adrian. The words on paper lagged behind the reality in the house, but they began to move in the right direction. For the first time in a long life built on clear lines, Adrian had to choose between the comfort of a neat one-man narrative and the messy, vulnerable truth of a shared life. The decision did not arrive as a single dramatic gesture. It came in small, accumulating choices. Which chair he pulled closer in the therapist's office, which name he wrote next to his own on school inquiry forms, which future he allowed himself to imagine when he came home late and found Leo asleep on the couch, sprawled across Eli's lap, all three of them framed in the soft glow of a lamp like a picture of a family he had never meant to have and no longer wanted to lose. Eli had always assumed that, sooner or later, he would be the one to go. That assumption lay quietly under everything, like a line of text hidden beneath every scene in the house. No matter how deeply Leo burrowed into his chest at night, no matter how many times his name appeared on feeding charts, shared calendars, and notes on the fridge, he never stopped seeing himself as temporary. The word "daddy," spoken by a toddler who did not understand contracts, had shaken that assumption, but not erased it. It had only made the ending feel sharper when it finally came. The more professionals talked about attachment and co-parenting, the more Eli feared that by staying he was doing something wrong. In theory, everyone kept saying it was better for Leo to have more than one stable adult. In practice, Eli knew too many stories of Omegas accused of overstepping, of being blamed when relationships fractured. He had read enough comments online under articles about surrogacy, lines about surrogates who did not know their place, about Omegas who tried to steal someone else's child. The words clung to him in the dark. Even though no one in the house had said them, he did not want to be the problem in Leo's story later. He did not want to be the source of conflict between the child and the man who had legally claimed him from the start. The thought of Leo, older, hearing an angry version of events where Eli was described as the one who complicated everything, made his stomach twist. So he did what felt, in a twisted way, like the only responsible thing. He started to prepare to leave. At first, it was only in his head. He would imagine packing his few clothes into 2 suitcases, folding the small collection of books he had acquired into a box, leaving behind the toys and the tiny clothes that were not his to take. He would rehearse conversations in his mind, trying to find words that did not sound like abandonment and failing every time. Then he opened his laptop and began to look at listings. Not the glossy apartments downtown, but small, anonymous places on the edges of the city. One room with a kitchenette, basement studios with low ceilings and narrow windows, places where no one would recognize his name or care who Leo's father was. He filtered searches by price and distance, pretending this was just idle curiosity. He spoke to the agency next, in a careful, measured call. He asked what the process would be to formally end his postnatal services at the end of the current month. He cited vague reasons about independence and mental health, about needing to rebuild his own life away from the house. On the other end of the line, the coordinator listened and jotted down notes, her tone professional and sympathetic. The contract allowed it. There would be paperwork, but no major obstacles. After that, the preparations became physical, in small, almost invisible ways. Eli began to sort his belongings when Leo napped. A pile for things he would take, a pile for things he would leave. He folded away memories before he had to fold clothes, telling himself that if he did the grieving now, it would hurt Leo less later. Leo noticed the shift first. Children usually did. He fussed more when Eli left a room, even for a moment. He clung longer to his shirt when handed over to other caregivers, fingers digging in as if trying to anchor himself. Nights, which had settled into a fragile routine, became fractured again. Leo woke more often, calling out in wordless sounds that still carried Eli's name inside them. He would not settle fully until Eli lay down beside the crib, one hand resting inside on the mattress so the baby could curl his fingers around it. The house staff felt the change like a drop in air pressure before a storm. They saw the way Eli's eyes lingered on the nursery door a second too long. They saw the apartment listings left open on his laptop when he forgot to close it. They caught Leo's sudden spikes of anxiety and traced them back to the subtle distance Eli was trying to create. Concern threaded through their conversations in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in the quiet moments between tasks. They brought it up to Adrian because they did not know what else to do with the information. He was already on edge from meetings with lawyers and therapists, from forms that refused to provide the right boxes. When he heard that Eli had asked the agency about ending his role, he felt something inside him tilt. It did not become real until he walked into the guest room one afternoon and found the printouts. They were spread out on the small desk, ordinary sheets of paper covered in grainy photos and brief descriptions. Studio, shared laundry, utilities not included. Far from the hill, far from the clinic, far from the life they had built. The paper crinkled under his fingers when he picked one up, as if it were too fragile to hold the weight it carried. He had imagined many possible conflicts with Eli over the months. He had prepared himself for demands for more money, for leverage, for formal recognition. He had braced for anger, resentment, even accusations. He had not prepared for this, a quiet exit, planned carefully so as not to cause drama, motivated by a desire to avoid hurting anyone. That knowledge hit him harder than any shouted argument could have. Eli was not trying to stay and take more. He was trying to leave to protect them, even if it broke his own heart in the process. The confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was sharp. It was less about raised voices and more about what lay under the words. Adrian realized with a kind of sick clarity that his silence had been read as rejection. His hesitation to name what Eli had become in their lives, his attempts to maintain the appearance of the original arrangement, had looked from the outside like distance, like a plan to eventually cut Eli out. In trying to avoid forcing Eli into a role, he had left him standing on a cliff edge with no reassurance that he was wanted where he was. Eli realized, in turn, that his attempt to protect Leo from future complications might itself be the most destabilizing thing he could do. The therapist's earlier warnings about sudden separations, about the impact on a child whose primary attachment figure vanished without explanation, stopped being abstract. They turned into vivid images. A small boy standing in a doorway, calling a name that no one answered. A house filled with echoes where there had once been footsteps and laughter. For a brief, frightening period, it genuinely seemed possible that Eli would walk away. The agency could facilitate it with a few calls. The contract allowed it. The world outside would barely glance up. It was full of its own chaos and quiet tragedies. Inside the house on the hill, though, 3 lives would be rearranged around an absence instead of a shared space. Leo would still have a legal guardian and a beautiful nursery. Adrian would still have a successful career and a carefully constructed narrative. Eli would still find somewhere to sleep and a way to survive. But the question had shifted. It was no longer about whether Eli had the right to call himself daddy in his own head. It was about whether Leo had the right to keep the person he had already chosen as such. Adrian's life had always been measured in outcomes. He was used to numbers lined up in neat columns, red turning to black, headlines with his name placed next to words like growth and record quarter. The story of a self-made single alpha building a legacy through calculated decisions was something he had learned to tell so often that other people repeated it back to him. In that story, vulnerability was a crack in the foundation, and compromise was a sign of weak leadership. Changing course in public meant giving ammunition to critics and competitors. The situation inside his own house refused to obey that script. In therapy sessions, with legal advisors, in late-night walks through the darkened nursery, he kept coming back to the same image. Leo's small body curling into Eli's side, settling as if gravity was strongest there. The way the child's whole frame went from tight to loose the moment Eli's arms closed around him. No stock price, no successful deal had ever produced that visible, immediate peace. The first broken daddy had exposed something raw in him, but it was the quiet fear of losing that scene entirely that finally cut through his resistance. He started to hear the therapist's earlier words in places he had not expected. In the car, driving back from a meeting. In his office, staring at a contract he could recite by heart. Secure attachment to more than one stable adult is not a threat, she had said. It is a protective factor, a gift. For most of his life, he had believed that being a father meant being the sole center of his child's universe. Anything less felt like failure. But when he watched Leo reach for Eli without fear, then turn and press a hand against Adrian's cheek with the same trust, something in that belief loosened. He began, slowly, to let go of the idea that love was a limited resource that had to be competed for and defended. Acknowledging Eli as a permanent figure did not erase his role. It deepened it, freed him from the desperate need to win a title that Leo had already handed out in his own way. Confronting his feelings towards Eli himself was harder. It required stripping away the layers of defensive humor and professional courtesy he had worn like armor since the first meeting in the clinic. Respect had been there from the beginning. Respect for the physical toll of pregnancy on a body that still turned up politely to every appointment. Respect for the quiet resilience of someone who had walked alone into a surrogacy office with nothing but a thin folder of medical records and the need to survive. Gratitude had followed when that same man became the only person who could calm his screaming newborn. Gratitude when Eli stayed awake through endless nights, when he learned every nuance of Leo's cries without complaint. Somewhere along the line, respect and gratitude had been joined by something warmer and more dangerous. The way Adrian's chest loosened when Eli laughed at one of Leo's clumsy discoveries, that unguarded laugh that came from somewhere deep and surprised even Eli. The way Adrian found himself standing closer in doorways just to share a moment, some small, ridiculous thing Leo had done with a spoon or a block. The way his attention drifted away from emails and towards the sound of voices down the hall, drawn there without his permission. He had built his life around the safety of transactions, money in exchange for service, loyalty in exchange for opportunity. Choosing family over image meant stepping into a space where no one could promise him a guaranteed return. It meant being willing to be seen as someone who had miscalculated, who had thought he was buying a neat solution and ended up wanting the person providing it to stay. It meant admitting that his fierce independence had not always been a virtue. Sometimes it had been a shield against exactly this kind of entanglement. He imagined how it would look from the outside. The self-made alpha who had built companies and then allowed his life to be reshaped by a surrogate and a child. There would be people who viewed that as weakness. He could almost hear the quiet, disdainful comments in certain boardrooms. He sat with that imagined judgment and weighed it against the very real weight of Leo's head on Eli's shoulder, the sound of the boys' laugh when both of them were in the room. The choice began to form in layers rather than as a single dramatic moment. He canceled the quiet plan that would have let Eli step away without obstacles. He called the agency and told them, in that flat tone he used when he would not negotiate, that they should stop processing any exit paperwork. He asked the lawyer not only how to protect himself, but how to formally protect Eli and Leo together if something happened to him. The questions themselves marked a shift. He was no longer trying to keep his life contained to one name on a line. Behind closed doors in his study, with only a pen, a stack of revised documents, and the quiet presence of the man he had once intended to let go, Adrian made a different kind of decision. It was not a merger, not an acquisition, not a clean exit. It was a commitment to restructure his life so that it reflected what was already true in the nursery rather than what would look best in a press release. He signed papers that acknowledged Eli as more than staff. He agreed to language that gave Eli a recognized role in decisions about Leo's future. Each signature felt less like losing territory and more like aligning the map with the ground he was already standing on. For Eli, hearing that choice finally spoken aloud was like exhaling after holding his breath for months. The tension in his shoulders did not vanish, but it shifted. There were still fears, sharp and persistent. Fear of being seen as a gold digger by people who would only ever know the surface of their story. Fear of future fights about parenting, of missteps that could send everything crashing down. Fear that the fragile balance they had found could topple if either of them pushed too hard. But beneath those fears was something new. The idea that he was wanted not only as a caretaker, not only as a body that had done its biological job and could now be released, but as a partner in parenting. As someone whose presence in Leo's life was not a temporary accident, but a chosen constant. And maybe, if they were careful and honest, as something more to Adrian than a co-parent, that possibility rewrote a script in Eli's mind that had always cast him as disposable. For the first time, he could see a future in which he stayed not because he had nowhere else to go, but because two other people in that house wanted him there. Not for what he could provide, but for who he had already become to them, long before anyone dared to put it into words. Transforming emotional decisions into legal structures took time. It was slower than any deal Adrian had ever closed and more fragile than any contract Eli had been asked to sign. The lawyer's office became another recurring setting in their story, as familiar as the nursery and the kitchen. Glass walls, dark wood, framed certificates on the wall, a carafe of water on the table, untouched more often than not. This time, the goal was not to separate roles cleanly, but to weave them together in a way that finally matched reality. The original surrogacy contract, once the governing document of this whole arrangement, lay in the middle of the table like an outdated map. Around it, new pages slowly accumulated. Guardianship clauses, emergency authorizations, financial addenda that did not treat Eli as a completed transaction. The new guardianship arrangement named Eli as a legal parental figure, even if the language wrapped that truth in cautious phrasing. He would be able to make medical decisions in emergencies, not just consult. He would be allowed to sign school forms instead of waiting for Adrian to come home and do it. He would be recognized as someone who could stand next to Adrian at any official meeting where Leo's future was discussed, not as an extra chair in the corner. Seeing his own name listed next to words like custodian and guardian made Eli's stomach twist. Part of him wanted to push the papers away to insist that he had no right to be there. Another part, older and quieter, hummed with relief. "You have been doing this already," that part reminded him. "The law is only catching up. These changes did not magically erase the system's bias against non-traditional families. There were still forms that assumed one mother and one father. There were still databases with fields that refused to accept anything outside their narrow set of options. But with every signed page, they carved out a recognized space for Eli to exist in those systems without having to lie or stand silently behind Adrian." There were financial documents too. The original compensation, once framed like a one-off payment for a service, was rebalanced into something that looked less like a purchased body and more like shared resources for a shared household. Joint accounts for household expenses, clear agreements about savings for Leo's future, separate accounts for personal autonomy so that Eli could walk into a bank or a shop without feeling like every card in his wallet belonged to someone else. It mattered to both of them that Eli not feel owned. It mattered that, if anyone ever tried to reduce him to a stereotype of an omega who stayed for the money, they would run into clean, transparent arrangements that told a different story. Then there were the less tangible agreements, the ones no lawyer could draft for them. In therapy sessions, they sat on neutral chairs and tried to translate daily life into shared expectations. Who takes the night shift when Leo is sick and both of you have work in the morning? How many holidays do you spend with distant relatives who still believe in one acceptable model of family? What do you do when a neighbor asks, too casually, which one of you is the real father? They practiced stating needs without accusation. I need you to tell me if you are overwhelmed before you break. I need to know I can say I am tired without being seen as ungrateful. They practiced hearing fears without immediately trying to fix them. The fear of being left, the fear of being trapped, the fear of being judged by people who would never bother to understand. Underneath all the signatures and structured conversations, another layer developed quietly in the spaces in between. In waiting rooms at the clinic when Leo got his shots, Adrian's hand sometimes found Eli's without ceremony, fingers curling around his in a brief grounding squeeze. On the couch after long days, Eli would lean against Adrian's shoulder, half asleep, while Leo snored softly across both of their laps. Those small acts of physical closeness, once unthinkable in the context of a transactional agreement, became as much a part of their life as shared calendars and grocery lists. The first time they registered Leo at a new pediatric clinic, the receptionist looked up from her screen to glance at them. One man filling in the primary guardian line, another man juggling a toddler who was fascinated by a pot plant in the corner. The three of them clearly arriving together, moving with the unconscious choreography of people who lived in the same space. She hesitated only a second before typing, then said it aloud as she checked the record. So, two fathers. The phrase landed in the air with a soft thud. Eli felt something in his chest unclench, a knot he had not realized he was still holding. The label was imperfect. It did not capture the path that had brought them here, but it was better than erasure. It was better than being listed as other, or not listed at all. Later, when Leo was a little older and his words came easier, he began to alternate without overthinking it. Sometimes he called Eli by name, sharp and delighted. Sometimes he reached for Adrian with a sleepy mumbled daddy. Sometimes, in moments of excitement or fear, he threw his arms up towards whoever was closest and shouted that same loaded word at both of them. The sound no longer broke Adrian the way the first time had. It did not stab at his sense of place. Instead, it mended something that had cracked years before he ever considered fatherhood, in a house where he had learned that love was conditional and scarce. Each time Leo used that word freely, for both of them, it stitched another small seam in that old wound. The paperwork, in the end, did not create their family. It simply stopped pretending that their family did not exist. It gave names and lines and legal weight to a reality that had been growing quietly since the first heartbeat flickered on a screen, since a newborn calmed only in Eli's arms, since a terrified single alpha admitted, if only on paper at first, that he did not want to do this alone. Years later, the house on the hill no longer felt like a carefully curated gallery. There were scuff marks on the hallway walls at toddler height, a shoe pile near the door that never stayed orderly, drawings taped to the fridge. There were still meetings and calls, still legal documents and careful security, but they were woven around something softer. School drop-offs, weekend pancakes, evening stories read with a child squeezed between two warm adults. Leo grew into a curious, determined kid who took it for granted that he had two dads. Sometimes he introduced them at school events by their first names, sometimes by that same word, unbothered by which one picked him up or tucked him in on any given night. For him, the origin story, with its surrogacy and contracts and unexpected attachment, was background noise. What mattered was who showed up when he fell, who laughed at his jokes, who sat with him when nightmares turned the dark into something too big. Life settled into patterns that would have seemed impossible back in the days of the studio above the laundromat. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and something burning slightly in the pan because Leo insisted on cracking the eggs himself. Evenings brought homework spread over the table, negotiations about screen time, a boy asleep across two sets of knees on the couch while a film played mostly unwatched. Eli's life was almost unrecognizable to the version of himself who had once counted coins on a sagging mattress. He still remembered the constant anxiety of unpaid bills, the feeling of being a body for hire in a world that saw omegas as either liabilities or assets. Now, when he woke in the middle of the night, it was usually because a small foot had found his ribs, not because of sirens outside or fear that he would find an eviction notice under his door. He had responsibilities, many of them, but they were tied to people he had chosen and who had chosen him back. When Leo shouted "Daddy" across a crowded playground and two heads turned instinctively, Eli no longer flinched. He just smiled and walked towards the sound. Adrian, looking back on his own journey, could see clearly the moment everything had begun to shift. It was not the day he signed the first contract, not the day he saw the first ultrasound, not even the day of the birth. It was the afternoon in the living room when his son had turned towards someone else and called him Daddy with all the unquestioning certainty of a child who knew his own heart. That crack in Adrian's carefully built shell had hurt. It had also let light in. He had paid, at the beginning, for an heir, a tidy answer to a legacy problem. What he ended up with was far messier and far richer. He found himself part of a configuration he had never planned for, a child who refused to fit into a lonely man narrative, an Omega who quietly rewrote his own script from disposable to indispensable, and a life that demanded vulnerability instead of just strategy. There were still moments that caught him off guard. Seeing Leo asleep between them on the sofa, one hand tangled in Eli's shirt, the other wrapped around Adrian's wrist. Catching his own reflection in a window, not alone but flanked by two figures he now thought of as his family. He had not expected to want that. Now, he could not imagine going back to the version of himself who had believed he was safest with only contracts for company. Outside, the world still had questions and opinions, but they mattered less than they once had. Inside the house on the hill, normal was defined differently. Normal was 3 toothbrushes in a cup. Normal was 2 voices reading from the same book while a boy tried to keep his eyes open for just one more page. Normal was the quiet knowledge that if one adult failed, the other would step in, not because of obligation on paper, but because of bonds forged in sleepless nights and hard conversations. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, take a moment to remember what you imagined when you first heard the title. Did you picture the Omega disappearing after giving birth, the Alpha staying alone with his heir, the child growing up in a house where everything was controlled, but nothing was truly shared? Or did some part of you hope that the contract would fail just enough for something human to slip through the cracks? Tell in the comments whose choice in this story touched you the most. Eli's decision to risk staying instead of disappearing quietly. Adrian's decision to break his own image and choose a family over a narrative built on control. Or Leo's simple, powerful choice of who to call Daddy first, and then again, and then without apology for either of them. And do not forget to support BL's Story of Love with a like and a subscription, so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how broken plans can become the beginning of a real home.